Alright guys, so it's Portia here. Politics and the government are really complicated and really confusing. As a responsible citizen, it's vital that we make sure we properly educate ourselves about what government actually does because it has a huge impact on us as citizens. So no matter which side of the political party you're on, you have to be educated. So I wanted to see how educated random people on the street were. I interviewed 3 different people, and you may be surprised by their answers. I asked them some simple questions like, what are the 3 branches of government? What does each branch do? How is a bill made? And what, besides Democrats and Republicans, are a 3rd additional party? So let's look at their answers. All right, Chris, what are the 3 branches of government?
Legislative, judicial, and executive.
Legislative, judicial, and executive.
Nice. Legislative, judicial, and executive.
To put it plainly, there's the legislative branch, which consists of Congress. There's the executive branch, which exists of the president, vice president. And then there's the judicial branch, which is part of the Supreme Court. The next question I asked them is, what does each branch do?
Judicial handles the court system. Executive passes new laws. Legislative, I don't know.
The judicial is responsible for upholding the law. Legislative is responsible for creating the law. And executive is responsible for enacting the law.
The legislative branch has got like the House, you know, and the Senate and whatnot. Yeah, and they do like the law stuff. And then the judicial is like your court stuff, all right? And executive is like the president.
So the legislative branch makes laws and passes legislation. They also review and restrict the annual budget, and they investigate any claims of wrongdoing at the hands of public officials. The executive branch, as much as some people would like to say they don't have any restrictions, they do. All they're able to do is manage foreign and domestic crises that the United States may be involved in, administer and execute the laws of the United States, fill government jobs such as cabinets, federal judges, and top military leaders, and set agendas. So again, there are limits to their power. Finally, the judicial branch consists of the Supreme Court, which rules on cases in much the same way that a smaller court would. We don't really hear a whole lot about what the Supreme Court judges do, and a lot of that's because they're busy. So they get an estimated 7,000 petitions a year, but they only end up reviewing about 100 to 120 cases annually. Typically, the Supreme Court only chooses to review cases that have consequences that reach far beyond the parties directly involved. So, for the example of human rights cases. They also review cases where a smaller court decision is in conflict with a prior decision that the Supreme Court has made in a similar case. So, how are the 3 branches connected? Well, again, they all work together for the good of the citizens, or so we hope. Each of the 3 branches are needed in order to properly run the government. They work together to ensure that the interests of the people is guaranteed. For example, all 3 branches are needed in order to enact a law. The legislative branch creates a law, then the president reviews it and either signs it or vetoes it, and the judicial branch ensures that the law is constitutional. There's also a thing called checks and balances. So each branch also regulates one another through checks and balances. The Constitution establishes what power each branch has. Each branch checks that the other is working within the confines of the Constitution and balances the other branches by taking action if it is found that they are promoting an unconstitutional act. Democrats and Republicans are the major parties, but can you name a third one? Here's their responses.
Independent.
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 There's actually a lot of different third parties. Some of them are really no longer in effect, so they're kind of the old school parties, but some of them have grassroots footings, and you may still hear about them a little bit. So, for example, there was the Federalist Party, there was a Democratic Republican Party, the Whig Party, and you're more than likely to hear about the Green Party, Libertarian Party, Tea Party, and Independent Party now. Now, the big question is, how did the two-party system start? So, in the Electoral College, there is a winner-takes-all system, meaning that the party who takes the majority of the votes will end up with all the votes. As the weaker parties realize that they're not going to win an election, they will form alliances with the stronger party that they're associated with in an attempt to challenge the opposing parties. As the Democratic and Republican parties grew to be the two major parties in politics, voters began veering away from voting for candidates outside of these parties because they essentially think that this is a trash vote and that their vote will just be tossed away because their third party's not really going to win anyway. So, if we did go to a more multi-party system, what impact would that have? Well, think about it. These third parties allow for alternate viewpoints, which will better represent the opinions of all citizens. Right now, again, Democrats and Republicans, it's kind of a black and white issue. Either you're on one side or another. But again, government is really complicated, and that's not always the way it works. So government's complicated. The views of the citizens are complicated and varied. With a third party or multi-party system, all you're going to be able to do is add more expertise to policies to make them stronger. This helps the policies, again, become stronger so that they will encourage more support and will be more likely to be passed. And that's good for everyone. Now, the fourth question I asked is, what's the basic process by which a bill becomes law? This was super tricky because, check out this infographic. Oh my goodness, there are so many steps. There are actually 10 steps involved. Let's check out what the responses were from the interviews I did.
All I know is that they run it through the Congress and Senate, and as far as after that, I don't know.
All right, thank you.
It is first introduced to the House, and then it goes to the Senate, and if it is ratified, it goes to the President for either signature or veto.
Yeah, so it gets generated in the House, and then it goes to the Senate, and then it goes to the President.
First off, it's good to remember that anyone can draft a bill, whether it's a citizen that holds no office, the president, or someone that holds a seat in a government setting. However, only members of Congress can bring this into legislation, which is a term that's used for a bill while it's in the approval stage. The members of Congress that bring the bill into legislation are referred to as sponsors. And so, once a bill is brought into legislation or the approval process, it goes before a committee. This committee studies the bill and considers if it has a chance to be passed. If the committee decides not to continue promoting the bill is effectively dead. After the bill is okayed by the first committee, it will move on to a subcommittee for further review and a hearing. The purpose of this hearing is to put the committee's response to the legislation on record. During this hearing, debates from the legislation's opponents, supporters, experts, the executive branch, and other public officials can be put on record. After this hearing is completed, the subcommittee can choose to make changes to the bill if they see fit. If they are satisfied with the bill, then the bill moves on to a committee for review. If the subcommittee cannot amend the bill in a way that is satisfactory, then the bill dies. Once the full committee receives the subcommittee's report of the bill, the committee votes on whether or not to recommend the bill to the House or the Senate. The House and the Senate are referred to as chambers. The bill will have to pass through both chambers before it's finalized. This whole process is called ordering a bill reported. Once the final bill is approved, it is voted on by members of the House or Senate, depending on which member received the legislation first. If the legislation does not receive enough votes from this chamber, the bill dies. If it passes, though, it'll move on to the next chamber. Once the legislation is received by the other chamber, it's routed through a new committee where it undergoes a similar process of reviews, hearings, amendments, and votings similar to the ones that it underwent in the first chamber. If it is found that the second chamber wishes to amend aspects of the bill, then members of both chambers form committees with the intent on coming up with a new agreement about the changes. If the changes cannot be agreed upon, then the bill dies again. But if the committee does agree on the changes, then a report about the finalized decision is written and filed. Once both chambers have agreed upon a bill in its final written form, the legislation goes before the president. At this point, he can approve the legislation, sign it, and boom, it's a law. But if the president takes no action within 10 days of receiving the bill, but the Senate is still in session, it automatically becomes law. But if the president disagrees with the bill, he can deny it and it'll be vetoed. If the president has not taken action within 10 days of receiving the legislation and Congress has ended its second session, then a pocket veto goes into effect and the legislation dies. But, again, the president doesn't always have the final say, as we discussed earlier. If the president vetoes a legislation, Congress can still try to override the veto, but this can only be done if the House and the Senate both pass the bill by a 2/3 majority. At this point, the president's veto is no longer in effect and the bill still becomes law. So, as you can see, there's a lot of basic elements to the government that all citizens should know. Thanks.